Hello and welcome to Overcome a Mental Health Podcast. I am your host, Travis White. It's a place for you to share your mental health stories. I'm very excited to introduce tonight's guest. I'll be speaking with Albert Bramante. Albert is a seasoned talent agent with more than 2 decades of experience in the entertainment industry and also holds a PhD in psychology from Walden University. Albert, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Travis, for having me on here. I'm really happy to be here.
The pleasure's all mine. I think we're going to have a great conversation. And I'm not going to waste any more time because nobody wants to hear from me. Why don't you go ahead and tell us about your journey?
Well, I was kind of born in a very peculiar situation. I was a different one in my family. And when I say different, I mean, I grew up in a blue collar family. My brothers, I'm the youngest of five. My brothers, were all athletes. My father was a football coach. My oldest brother was a football coach. And they were all into sports, lived, bred, bleed, whatever, athletics. For me, I couldn't, didn't have any interest, both as a player and even as a spectator. Just didn't do anything for me, sports. But I enjoyed reading. I enjoyed thinking. I was a thinker, always was, still am. And so I was always a deep thinker as a child. And I think that's what really led me to studying mental health because I was a loner, and I wasn't bullied as a child. I was really had a good family, and I really had, acquaintances, associates. I never really had friends, but I wasn't picked on or ridiculed or bullied in any way. But I found myself as a loner being, spending a lot of time in the library. So a typical 15, 16-year-old kid might not be reading books like, How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie or The Seven Habits of Highly Effective People, or Feeling Good by David Burns, which were all very popular in the early 90s when I was really, started reading this stuff. And I just became so thrilled and captivated by the human mind. I think just my whole curious nature and attraction and deep topics really led me down to the rabbit hole, what you could call the mental health aspect of things. So at the end of my sophomore year, I said, I really want to major in psychology. I made that declaration. And I wanted a PhD. That was my goal. And I reached the goal, of course, but I knew since I was a teenager, this is what I wanted to do. Now, I was also interested in creative arts too. So in high school and college, I was very much involved in all these different organizations, and high school, including the drama club. And so I was very much involved in the performing arts world, not really professionally. And at that time, I really didn't know I had an interest in it. It wasn't until like years later when I was working out in the field after I received my master's degree, I started doing some work around 9/11 work, crisis intervention, counseling, and all of the important things. And with that, and so really, that's where most of my work came into play. Professional. That's was the start of my professional career, and I started working with actors alongside of doing the social service work, and that's what led me to becoming a little bit of an actor myself, dabbling a little bit into it. Realized it wasn't necessarily for me, but I loved being around actors. So I started a business to kind of support actors along the way, representing them, submitting for jobs, being starting my own agency. And so that's how I got started as an agent. During this time, I also became started teaching, and I also decided I would go back for my PhD. I might as well. I was already
Yeah.
halfway there, and I didn't know what was going to happen in my life. I wanted the insurance plan of having a doctorate, and so I went back to school, and then I started wanting to study because one thing that kept theme that kept popping up in all my work, whether it be a college professor or a talent agent, was the theme of self-sabotage and self-defeating behavior that just kept coming up. I was witnessing this with a lot of actors I was working with, and I was also witnessing with students I was working with. My class is just a high degree of self-sabotage. So I really wanted to kind of study this, to kind of like figure out what was going on here. So my doctoral dissertation was on self-defeating behavior in performing artists. And so that was a way of like really blending all my worlds together, the mental health psychology world with show business. So then that's kind of like where I am today. And then several years after, my PhD, I wrote a book called Rise of the Script. And yeah, it's been kind of like, one of the spaces I've been working a lot in now is like performance mindset and getting people to, help them get out of their own way, recognize self-imposed limitations and things like that.
Yeah, makes sense. And it's the whole like showbiz like side of things. It's like these people are high achieving people. Why do you think so many high achievers like it takes them? It's almost like some people have to hit a brick wall before they can start healing. Why do you think that is?
Well, a lot of it is survival. A lot of it is self-protection. A lot of it is self-protection. And especially, really depends on that person's past because if there's trauma, if there's any type of childhood trauma, um, the brain goes into overdrive protection. Our brain protects us. That's its purpose. The nervous system in the brain, it's really its sole purpose is to protect us and to keep us safe.
Yeah, that's
And
that.
and that's what it did years ago. If we were back in the hunter gatherer Neanderthal days, we had so many things thrown at us that were dangerous, life threatening every day. And it wasn't until, many years later, of course, we're a lot safer, but our brain is still doing the same thing. So a lot of times if we're thrown with any perceived danger, which is any change, any stepping outside our comfort zone, our brain says, okay, regroup. We gotta abort the mission in a sense, whatever that is. And so a lot of times with self-sabotage, it's a self-protective mechanism.
Yeah, and I could see that being that way. Like it totally makes sense. And while we're talking about like the high kind of achiever, I have another question in regards to that. So high pressure careers such as acting and entrepreneurship, what do you see as the most understood aspect of high functioning anxiety?
Well, again, I would say anxiety is also self-protection.
Yeah.
And fear is what keeps us safe. I mean, that's what keeps us alive, to avoid anything that could be potentially dangerous. Unfortunately, nowadays that can be working on overdrive. So it can sometimes work against us by protecting us by the very things from the very things we need to do. And that's where the anxiety prevails in because it is a survival mechanism. There's no way that anybody can escape life without feeling any type of anxiety. That's unrealistic and actually dangerous because there are times where you have
Mhm.
to be vigilant. So and that's where that whole fight or flight mode gets activated to protect us. So the only thing is, if we have experienced a childhood trauma, and I don't necessarily just have to be sensational childhood trauma. It could just be, other siblings were favored over than you were as a child. It could have been that maybe you had to really fight hard to get your parents' attention and love. Maybe you were ridiculed by your teachers a lot. So little things like that add up over time. And then what we call like micro traumas. And eventually what they can do is add up and then eventually your body is just in a constant, state of fight or flight mode, which is what it, triggers anxiety. Because anytime we have a peak in anxiety, it's really a rush of cortisol, which is the adrenaline, whatever you want to call that, to prepare our body for fight or flight mode.
Yeah, interesting. Interesting. It's yeah, and it's what's the word I'm looking for? Well, these people though, like when they realize something's wrong, and what do you think are the first steps? What would you say are the first steps to start your healing journey?
I would say the first steps is to first recognize that this is happening because most people that are in that mode of self sabotage or self protective mode don't really get a clear picture of what's going on or really have clear insight. They might just think, okay, these are opportunities that seem scary or that seem not worth my time, or whatever it is that the brain messages your brain will tell you. And then I would also kind of educate and say it's incredibly easy to stay safe, to be in your comfort zone, and to talk yourself out of things that may be a bit uncomfortable or scary in the moment. So it's one thing is to kind of work, we have to work against that, fight against that a little bit, because it's easy to talk ourselves out of doing things. I mean, how many times have we talked ourselves out of doing something that was great, or even if it was going to the gym or going to exercise, we talked ourselves out of it. I'm too tired today. I'm aching. Whatever it is, your brain tells a story to get, and it's all protective, self-protective, and it's not. It's doing its job. Your brain. So the one thing I would kind of say, the first steps would be to realize that this is happening, and then B, work a little bit harder every day to do something a little bit different, or do little things that step outside your comfort zone. Maybe go to a networking event, or do it, go, even if it's online and initially a virtual event. Do something where you're meeting new people, and it's not entirely threatening because when you go to these events, everyone's there to meet other people, so it's not like you're approaching people totally cold. So, but it's still something that requires you to put yourself out there. And little things, like I would say like that. I do little things each day that will kind of push the needle and do something a little bit different. Because a lot of people sit and expect their life to change, but they don't do anything about it. They sit there year in and year out expecting their life to change, but they're not changing themselves. We have to change first, and then everything else around us will change.
Yeah, and that's so true. And it's you said one thing that I really absolutely love, and I think I've mentioned it on the show a couple times, is recognizing that you have a problem, that there's something going on. Because I think about like myself with my own mental health problems. If I would have never admitted that I had a problem, there's so many different things that I know, like that I would have never taken care of.
Right. Right, absolutely, and that's the whole thing too, is like, the knowing stage is very important, and to understand that this is sometimes it's like all we are is telling stories to ourselves. That's not true, and we distort a lot of things. We delete, we distort, the important information. Um, like I work as as an agent, and a lot of times, an actor may not get a job, and then they'll immediately assume, "Oh, well, that casting director, that producer doesn't like me." And I'm like, "Well, did they tell you that?" "Well, no." "Well, how did you come to that conclusion?" And that's where I'm like, you just jumped from like A to Z without.
Hmm.
So I think an important step is also not to react, and to also really consider, even the stuff that we get that may not be the best news possible, that, or when situations or things that we put our mind to don't go our way, is to really do a deep dive and figure out, okay, is there anything I can learn from this? Is there anything that can be educational here? Is there anything that maybe I'm blowing this out of proportion, or telling a story of something that doesn't even exist?
Yeah, in that type of situation, I have to raise my hand and say guilty because I've told
Me too.
myself multiple stories and that aren't true, like multiple
And again, we all
times.
do that. We
Yeah.
all do that. I think the first thing is just to acknowledge that this is a reality, that most of the time, we're telling stories about what we think has happened or perceive what happened, and that's not really what happened. I mean, or at least the charge of it, it
Hmm.
is the emotional charge is a little way too activated.
Yes, you're exactly right. And you being in a high achieving uh, job yourself, have you ever do you ever find yourself struggling with anything like this, like what we've been discussing? Have
Oh,
you?
yeah, I mean, I can't, I gotta call myself out. I mean, yes, absolutely. There were times even when I was in my, finishing up my PhD, where I thought for a moment, I can't do this. I'm gonna quit. I'm gonna stop. Because, but what kept me going was, after, first of all, was not reacting in emotion, because a lot of people sometimes react too rash, when they're in an emotional state, and that's the worst time in the world to actually act out on something because we're not thinking logic doesn't is not coming into play here. So once I would calm down from these episodes, I realized, okay, well, number one, I still got to pay back my student loan debt, whether I quit or not. I might as well wait through it. At least I have something to make it worthwhile that I'm paying for, not for a waste of several years. And this is really what I wanted to do. I mean, I think for me, the frustration wasn't the coursework. I enjoyed the coursework. I enjoyed the research. It was a dissertation that really threw me for a loop. And I talked to a lot of PhDs, and they all said the same sentiment that it's really that part of it that
Hmm.
really is the bane of the existence right there. But it's something that we all go through, and I think that was also what helped me was like, okay, it's normal for people to want to quit here, I get the urge to, and I just kept pushing through, and eventually, obviously, I came out the other side. But I can tell you, if I did quit, I would have been safer, but I would have been living with regret.
Yeah.
Especially towards the later part in life when I'm like, I had the opportunity for a PhD, I never took it. I was like, no, I don't want that. And then also, even putting my book together, that was a big, thing that was preventing me, holding me back. I would always sit for several years, I was telling people I'm going to write a book, I'm going to write a book, I'm going to write a book. Because I had the dissertation, I was like, well, I'm going to write a book, I'm going to write a book, I'm going to write a book. 'Cause I already had something. But I wouldn't do it. I would sit in front of a blank piece of paper, type of a couple of sentences, read them, get unhappy with them, delete them, and nothing. And I'm sitting there going like, and at first I was like, well, maybe this isn't for me. Who am I to write a book? Imposter syndrome, hello. And that's where, finally I said, it's gonna be another situation. I'm gonna regret it. I had the opportunity, and if I didn't take that, I would have really been unhappy. And it would have been much safer route to take, but it would have been, a situation that I would have regretted on. When I talk about
Yeah.
regret, this is why I tell people all the time to do what they want to do or live their dreams, because the true nature of regret is not the foolish decisions we make or the stupid things we've done or the foolish things we've done. The most sort of anguish for people that are like towards the end of their life is missed opportunities, regret, things that they could have done, but they didn't because of fear or comfort. And now it's too late, and they wound up, absolutely regretting it. So that's what I would say is the biggest source of regret is doing things and, and in a sense, and, not doing things that were presented to you.
And for you, I think the most important thing is you pushed through all the hard and got to where you're at. Like and I think that's important.
Yes.
So with the people that you work with, say you call them your clients,
Mhm.
uh, are there like common tools that you see that or methodologies that you see that have worked across the board to help them kind of change their mindset?
Well, I think reframing is important. I think that's the biggest thing is, reframing, and two areas that I like that I really like to give tools for reframing is the idea of failure. Now, in my work, one of the statements that I always um, liked was there's no such thing as failure, only feedback. And then because that signifies that you fell forward, that every failure is a learning experience and one step closer to success. And that's a perspective I think we can all take. And the other one is, and I read this out of a book, I can't, there was no person to quote it this, but it was a really brilliant quote. And it was, there's no such thing as rejection, only a simple reminder that our services are not needed today. So I think if we can look at the no's, because very rarely when we get told no, whether it's in a business or any other type of situation, it's not always mean that it doesn't mean not ever, it just means not now. So you don't get the job, well, it's just not now. That's not the right timing for you. So it keeps us in that growth mindset perspective of, those two things alone really perpetuate what we call the growth mindset. And so that's extremely important. Another other couple of tools that I would say, not necessarily a tool, but a behavior, is you want to start really cultivating social relationships with people that are going to support you in a positive way. So a peer group, an accountability group, people that are going to really support you and build you up along with themselves. Because another thing that can really prevent us from moving forward is the crowd we keep. If we're around negative people all the time, well, then we're going to become negative ourselves, and we're going to start becoming bitter and cynical ourselves. So, not necessarily a tool, but a behavior is to really start associating yourself with people. Other types of things I would say is keep a journal. I kind of call it like the happy file, but it's like a modified gratitude journal where you write down everything good thing that's happened to you. And you just spend a lot of time documenting that. That could be you got praise from an audience member, got praise on a job interview, or praise from a customer, or a former, person who worked with you as a client. Anytime you get the positive feedback or people that are above you that give you a good performance report, you document it and you just keep documenting it in your file. And then you have this long file. And then now, when you have moments of self doubt or when things aren't going your way at the moment, you just pull out your happy file, and it's kind of like keeping you connected to the world around you. So the happy file is another tool that I will really recommend. Another important tool is your calendar. And this is what will help you keep momentum. A lot of people you'll hear people say, someday I'm going to do this, someday I'm going to do that, and one day I'll get to this, and one day. And my response is, someday and one day are not on the calendar. I don't see that anywhere. The important thing is to start, and this is what held you accountable. And helped me accountable too with like writing my book is, okay, so when will chapter one be completed by? What date? Or whatever the goal is. You start breaking it down. It's like, okay, and what date will you commit to having this done? And if you're working with something like this is where you say, okay, you pull out your calendar together and say, okay, give me a date. Not someday I'm gonna do this, because it'll never happen if you don't if you talk about it conceptually rather than realistically. So very simple tool, the calendar. And most of the stuff are simple, but yet powerful. They're very simple techniques, and they don't take a lot, much brain power to really implement, but they're very powerful.
Yeah, I agree. And you touched on a couple things that I think are really important. Community. I've it's another thing
Mhm.
that's been brought up a few times on this show is it's so important to have that group of people in your corner when you're working through changes in your life, especially when it comes to mental health. But I would go even beyond mental health. I just think in general, like that community is really, really important.
Mhm.
And setting goals, like that's something that I've been working on this year. It's I had to do it for this podcast. I feel like before, like I've had this idea if I wanted to talk to people and I wanted to talk on mental health, just because I've struggled so much with it. But for the longest time, it was just an idea. And I was like, okay, at the very beginning of this year, I was like, okay, I need to write down goals of where I want to be in like a year from now. And
Mhm.
I'm slowly getting there, but I'm still pushing through and doing it. And then the last
Yeah.
thing I want to touch on is the journaling. I actually read a study. I can't remember exactly what it was, but I'll tell you kind of just the basis of it. Like there was some study done somewhere. I can't remember exactly where, but it was people, if you journal at night and write down your thoughts, especially the ones that are kind of weighing on you and weighing you down, if you do it right before you go to sleep, you'll actually be able to fall asleep quicker and you'll sleep better.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and that's because you have a clear intention. And I think
Hmm.
that's why, journaling, you writing things down is very, very powerful. And, even if you plan your day ahead of time, saying, okay, tomorrow, This is what I plan on what I want to have done. And you map that out. You map out the day before. Now, yeah, there are chances where you get sidetracked and things will get thrown at you that you didn't plan for. But you're more likely to complete something when you outline it and when you actually declare it, because it's like you're putting it out there. You're putting it out in the universe. So that's really important to consider there too.
I love it. I love all this stuff. It's just I'm no don't have any PhD or any background in it, but it just like all this mental health stuff. It just almost puts like a fire inside me to. I just love hearing it all. There's so many
Hmm.
different things. I feel like a lot of people too. Just talking in general, I feel like we get into autopilot and we kind of get in this state that we're just stuck kind of, on repeat mode and we're just doing this type of thing because we have to. And we're just, how can someone begin to recognize that they're operating on autopilot before it's too late?
Well, the main thing is an autopilot. It's kind of like if you ever seen a movie like Groundhog Day, it's like very similar to that, where the same, days were just the same. Not, it's like you're going through emotions, but nothing's improving. And, every day is starting to blend together. And so that would be the first clue. Like, because usually as human beings, what we're supposed to do is every month or every, couple of months, we're supposed to be getting better at what we're doing. We're supposed to evolve and become stronger and more powerful or even more successful. So if you find yourself like staying in the same area for 6 months to a year, or even more than that, that might be an indication that you are in autopilot. And how many times have you pushed things that you wanted to do on a back burner, and said, "Oh, you don't have time for it," or "It's right now. I'll do it later." And so procrastination. So if you find yourself being a major procrastinator, that might be an indication you're on autopilot. So and that's the time to really do some self-reflection, because most of the time when people it's not due to lack of time that people procrastinate, it's because of the lack of belief in themselves, or again, they're recovering from their own trauma. So it's like that's what will keep you in that negative loop of procrastination constantly.
Yeah, I have been known to be a bit of a procrastinator in my days, so I can highly relate to what you're saying there. It's it's just
Yeah.
it's like once I push past it, like I'm usually fine. It's just like just do it, just do it, just do it.
Yeah. Well, and that's the whole thing too, is just take action. And that's where I think, every day I would say make a commitment to do one action. It doesn't have to be a large action. It doesn't have to be, anything substantial in the beginning. Even small actions over time, they're going to build, and eventually, you're going to really start reaching these, magnificent milestones by taking, consistent daily small actions, even. So I would definitely suggest that taking small actions.
Yeah, and it's funny that you say that because I feel like over this past year, the small actions that I've taken, I'm actually reaching further now to take bigger actions since I've taken all these small ones. I'm like, you know what? This is a little bit more out of my reach, but
Hmm.
I just achieved this. I just hit this milestone. What if I, you know, push a little bit harder and just go a little bit further and do a little bit more?
Right. And it's all about just taking these small actions and taking one step back. Okay, now you did this, now let's do this and let's do that. And let's just keep building, and then that will stop you from living in automatic pilot, because now you're doing something different. And once the interesting thing about momentum is once you start, it's hard to stop. You're not going to stop, because now you get one step. Like even for me writing my book, once I wrote one chapter, the next chapter was written, next time, and then a third, and then eventually, I had a manuscript ready for an editor. So it takes time, but the important thing is to take that action. And yes, it's going to be a little uncomfortable. It may be a little scary, and that's okay. And I think this is where you have a good support network that can kind of guide you through that. Like, and and then it's okay to be a little scared because the more you do that, and we can even reframe anxiety or fear because if you look at fear, the emotions of fear and excitement, they're the same symptoms in the body. The butterflies in the stomach, the elevated heart rate, the breathing heavy, even sweating a little bit. But instead of saying that, it's anxiety, what if we reframed it and said it's excitement? So you're not nervous to give that speech, you're excited to give that speech. You're not nervous to approach this person, you're excited to approach this person. So, and I think the important thing is like, okay, we may have the reaction, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be bad, that has to be nerves. So I think getting uncomfortable with just that sensation and, referring as excitement, it will kind of help you, propel you and move forward.
Yeah, and that's actually a great way of putting it because I've never personally thought of it that way because I just think, oh, this is fear, this is nerves. But like if you, because I think you're right on the spot. Like if you reframe that as excitement, there's so much more. There's a lot of power to that.
Yes, absolutely. There definitely is a lot of power to that.
And I'd love for you to give us like you have your book out,
Hmm.
Rise Above the Script, I want to say.
Yes,
Would you be able to give us a synopsis of that?
sure. Well, it's kind of a roadmap about self-sabotage and helping you understand the different facets behind it. So I talk about self-esteem, and I talk about, obviously there's been talk ad nauseum about self-esteem, but it's important anyway to address. I talk about the consequences of low self-esteem, but also I talk about how sometimes having what I call toxic high self-esteem, which is like a synonym for arrogance or pompousness you know, or elitism in a sense, where you think you're better than everybody else, and how that can be a form of self-sabotage because very often it's fragile high self-esteem. And the reason why it's fragile high self-esteem is because it's um, most people they don't like getting any critiques at this point, or they get really you know frustrated or mad when they're criticized or when people don't share that high view of themselves. So, but that can prevent you from moving forward a big time because you're not coachable and not able to learn. And then I have a whole unit on self advocacy. Now, self advocacy is a term that's often used in the community mental health community that refers to your belief in your effectiveness in doing something. So, it's important to have especially a reformer or any type of professional, you have belief that you can be effective in what you do. It's a little different. Self-esteem is more global. This is more specific, to what you're doing. And then I talk about personality factors. And one of the major models I go into is what we call the big five traits, which are openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And every human being has a varying degree of these five traits. Now, how lay the groundwork of how they're important for dealing with self-sabotage. For one thing, we need to be higher in openness because that means being creative. That means being able to look at things from other perspectives, be open-minded. Conscientiousness, which is one of the biggest predictors of success, both vocationally, academically, personally, professionally. And that refers to like your discipline, your focus, your determination, your business sense. And so what we really need to be doing for anybody is to really increasing our conscientiousness, accountability, productivity, and then extroversion. Now that doesn't necessarily mean we have to be led to the party, but in order to be successful, we have to be able to communicate with people, and at least you're moderately comfortable with that. And then agreeableness means how coachable are you? How open are you to trying out new things or being guided or led by somebody else, which is very important. And then finally, neuroticism refers to sounds a little harsher than what it is, but what really is neuroticism purely means is how reactive you are to stress. So if you're a type of person that gets anxious very easily, then you might be more higher on the neuroticism trait. versus somebody who's very laid back would be low in that. And why is this all important? Because when it comes to self-sabotage, one of the biggest things that kept coming out in my doctoral research was the relation between high neuroticism and low conscientiousness. So when you combine both of those traits together, somebody who's, has kind of a low discipline focus but high propensity for anxiety, that's going to be perfect storm for self-sabotage. Again, because that requires a high degree of self-protection. So, um, so that kind of gives us like now can have an open conversation here about what we can do. And then I talk about fear of success, because I have a whole unit in my book on fear of success. And again, this is not the type of fear people walk around saying, "Hey, I have fear of success today." Everybody's chasing success. What's really more scarier is the outcome or the responsibilities or whatever's lying on the other side of success. Maybe a change in your identity because our identity is very important. Um, More responsibility, more pressure. That can be scary for a lot of people. And then also relationships. So, one chapter I have is on relationships where I mentioned how a lot of our success um, will impact the relationships around us, both in a positive and sometimes in a negative way. If somebody in our life is threatened by our success. And we see this sometimes with successful people is their family or their friends might look at them in, a negative light if they're dealing with their own insecurities. Like, who does he or she think she is by thinking they're better than us? And you may get messages like that. Of course, since we are loving human beings, we're going to get affected when we hear that in some way. And so therefore, it's like, well, maybe I am too ambitious. Let me step back. And what really is going on is they're the ones that have to really work on themselves, not us. And then another thing that I talk about, like one of my last chapters, is your view of money. How do you view, what's your relationship with money? Because if now everybody's will probably say, "Well, I love money." Maybe you do consciously, but then I would say, "Do you really?" Because if you grew up with sometimes these messages that we've got from society, from religion, from our family, that money is evil or money is corrupt, people only corrupt people are rich or only greedy people are rich. Our money is the root of all evil, which is a lie because that was never the initial quote. That was misquoted. Because it was the real quote was the love of money is the root of all evil, not money. Money itself is a neutral concept. So, but if you have the subconscious belief that money is radioactive or dirty or repulsive because of what you were told, then therefore what your brain is going to do is as soon as you get it or end up close up to getting it, either get rid of it or stop you from getting it. So that's the biggest form of self-sabotage right there. Because a lot of times when people, what self-sabotage will often happen is people very close sometimes getting to what they want, getting to their goal. But then they either make a mistake or they do something that just completely throws that out the window. And it's hard to understand that. And that was one of the lessons that I had to really learn as when I was beginning really my psychological studies. It's how people are sometimes comfortable and even wanna stay in that victim mentality. So the moment that anything comes that remotely means that they're gonna be successful, they're gonna throw that away because it's scary. It's like, "Well, I don't wanna deal with that." Because initially, I don't wanna give up my victim status or whatever that is. So that was one of the biggest things that I've learned, especially in the mental health community, is a lot of people don't like getting better, because the idea of getting better means a change in your identity, more responsibility, whatever that is.
Yeah. So cool. Like, I love all this stuff. You sound like you were going to say something else.
I was just gonna kind of completely, wrap that all up with my book, and that's the message is really just ways to get out of our own way. So because most people, when you talk about the psychology of money, people are gonna say, "Oh, I love money, I want money." I'm like, but do you really? Yeah, and why do you think we see some of these people who hit the lottery or maybe celebrities or athletes that get a major deal and now they're worth millions and then 2 or 3 years later or even 5 years later, they're in more debt than they were when they started. because they didn't budget their money properly. They just got rid of it as fast as they could.
Yeah, I've heard that story multiple times before with like people who make that type of money.
Hmm.
And I do want to touch base on one thing really quick though, is the victim mentality. I remember a day in therapy and my therapist told me you need to stop being the victim. But the funny thing is for the longest time I didn't know I was being the victim because I didn't see it that way.
Hmm.
And then when he explained all the things I was doing that made me look like the victim, I was like, okay, this makes sense. Like I've never seen it that way, but now that you explain it, like I know what I have to do.
Yeah. And it's not about blame it. It's really about
Hmm.
just taking responsibility, for even the things around us. Because yeah, there's a difference between responsibility and blame, but it's like, no, you're a survivor. Even if even if you suffered a trauma, I don't really like the word trauma victim. I like the word trauma survivor,
Yeah.
because it's like, no, you don't have to be a victim. Yes, that what happened to you is unfortunate, or the situation might have been unfortunate, but that doesn't mean that it has to stop you, because very often what happens in the victim mentality, you start re-victimizing yourself. It's just a constant, like, okay, you're just going to keep, self-harming yourself. Maybe not, physically, but psychologically, mentally, yes.
Yeah, and there's times though that I would say that self-harming yourself psychologically is just as draining and as bad as can be just as bad as like harming yourself physically just because the damage that you do to your brain and it's so easy to do.
Yeah. Well, but also, the psychological wounds last a lot longer too, and it's harder to really pinpoint them, because, and I give this other example too, that, when we were kids, especially my, generation, one of the nursery rhymes that we were always told was, or the slang was, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me." And that's not true,
Hmm.
because, the first part may be true, but names will never hurt me. No, names can hurt even worse than those sticks and stones can. Because when you talk about a mental or psychic injury, there's no bounds there. At least with a physical injury, okay, there's, you clean it up and you heal it, and it's gone. But not a mental or emotional injury is invisible.
Yeah, that's for sure. And it's like there was there's some things that came up in therapy and it's like I didn't even know I was battling them.
Hmm.
And it's like it's been years and years of me trying to battle them and overcome these things. And they're most of them are just going back to some medical issues that I had. It was like I didn't know I was internally like withholding
Hmm.
this or holding this type of thing until it was brought out. And I was like, wow, like it's taken this long to get past that.
Right. Yeah. Well, a lot of people are walking around for years not, getting insights. And so that's the first step, is once you know that this is a problem, or that this is an issue, that's the first step of getting better and progress.
So I'm gonna turn this kind of oh, go ahead. If I cut you off, go ahead.
No, I'm done. So
Okay.
go ahead.
I'm gonna turn this back to you, more of a personal question. How has helping others deepened your own sense of purpose?
Well, the biggest thing is it gave me a sense of purpose. I mean, that's really what, it helps me stop feeling sorry for myself, or stop, feeling a rut, or feeling like I'm not important, because I'm like, no, I am important. I need to help, I'm here to help other people too. So and that's one of the biggest things that really can help people get out of a rut, is to go out and help people, you know, go out and volunteer. Because believe it or not, volunteering really activates such positive emotions when we're giving back and helping the community. So, and I know some colleagues of mine that are psychologists that will actually prescribe, you know, charity work, as a way to kind of get over that rut. Because very often, a lot of times, number one, you're helping other people, but also you're getting out of the house and you're actually socializing with people. And when you have an anxiety or a mood disorder, one of the things that you really don't want to have is a lot of free time and downtime, because then you start ruminating, and they just get festering these thoughts. And whether they're thoughts from anxious thoughts or depressing thoughts, they just keep circulating in the brain. And for me, I've dealt with depression through my life, clinical depression, and it's not fun. But I felt like, when I got that sense of purpose where I can help other people, it was a sense of, okay, it pulled me out of that, because you really can't be feeling sorry for yourself and at the same time be helping other people. Just, it's like they cancel each other out. So it's a good thing, in a sense.
Yeah, yeah, I get it. And it's let's see, where was my thought going now? uh that's where it was. Okay. Sorry. My mind just I hit a brick wall for a second
Yeah,
there.
but just what we do a lot.
As a purpose. Like I think that's another important thing to kind of throw out there because until you like sometimes I feel like until you find that purpose, it's easier to get stuck in these kind of autopilot or burnout modes, whatever you want to call them, because
Hmm.
it's like you're not living for anything. I mean,
Right.
you are, but if that makes sense, I don't want to say you're not living for anything because you could be, but
No, you are absolutely. I mean, and that's the whole thing. It's like when now you have a purpose to live for when you're helping other people, because usually when you're in that loop of depression or anxiety, you start to feel that your life is meaningless, and that's a very scary thing, the place to be at. But when you doing something to help other people, it gives you that purpose. So now your life is meaningful. So
yeah.
you go from meaningless to meaningful. Yeah.
And I remember the other point I was going to speak about came back to me. You had mentioned that, like when you have time, too much time on your hands, you
Hmm.
get stuck in these modes of overthinking and anxiety or depression. It just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. I can't calculate how many times that's happened to me, like personally, because I mean, it's like I just think of like a month ago, I was having some really slow days at work, and everybody else seemed to have more work than me, and I was like, okay, do they not like me? Why are they not giving me more work? Am I not worth it? Am I not good enough?
Hmm.
And then all of a sudden, this last month, it's like all piled on. I was like, okay, I was just thinking dumb thoughts that make no sense.
Yeah. Well, and that sometimes happens though, is that we start to real and once you realize that they're just thoughts, because the on a daily basis, they say we have 70,000 thoughts that enter our brain from the moment we wake to the moment we're sleeping. So we don't necessarily have to pay any mind to them. Doesn't mean just because they enter our brain or our head does not mean we have to pay attention to them, or give them any energy. So, and I think the important thing is to understand that that's all they are, thoughts. And just as fast as they entered our brain, they can exit. I think that's the important thing.
I totally agree with you. Just a few more questions here. So, in your line of work, you hear all these stories of, you know, what's going on in other people's lives, and some of those I would imagine could get kind of hard to listen to. What practices keep you grounded while you're kind of dealing with all these other people's emotions as well?
Well, number one thing is self care. I mean, taking breaks. Like I may not plan like sessions back to back. I want to give myself a little bit of a break. Even doing something simple like a grounding ritual where I'll just like sit and and prepare myself, and kind of like even put like in my imagination like a little bubble around me. That I'm not going to get affected by that. What they tell me, I can still be show empathy, but that doesn't mean I'm going to be affected by it
Yeah,
or let it bring me down. So
that makes sense. All right. And kind of the last main question here, then it's a few follow-up
Hmm.
things. If there's one message that you hope a listener takes away from this conversation, what would it be?
That we have the chance to really become better, and that we are enough and that we all have the answers within us. It's just a lot of times we let fear take over, uncertainty take over, but if we can remove all of that and just listen to our intuition and listen to our inner guidance, we can achieve a lot.
Awesome. Absolutely love it. And where can people find you?
So you can find me on my website, albertbramante.com. You can also find me on LinkedIn under Albert Bramante. And yeah, feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to get a hold of you and we can have a conversation. And also check out my book, on Amazon, and it's also available as an audiobook. So yeah,
Perfect.
thank you.
And last thing is we covered a lot of ground here. Is there anything that we did not discuss that you would like to bring up?
Uh, Just again, I would just say that we can be our own worst enemy, if we allow it to happen. But again, just thinking of yourself as a creator, not a victim, is the most important thing.
Absolutely love it. Well, Albert, thank you for coming on the show. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Well, thank you, Travis. I really appreciate you having me on here.
And thank you to all those that have listened. Please, if this resonated with you, please share it. And you can find us on all major podcast platforms. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.